Today we want to talk about a new topic, transaction exposure. Next slide. We have 6 sections. We have 6 main ideas we want to go through. The first section we want to talk about what type of exposure out there, and in this topic we only want to focus on the so-called transaction exposure. And then once we have this exposure, this type of risk and uncertainty, if we want to manage this type of uncertainty and risk, then what type of strategy that the corporate manager would be able to adapt. And we have a variety of methods, and we kind of break that into 2 different categories. The first category is the so-called financial hedging. That means that we use financial instruments such as like a forward contract. That will be in the second section. And then we have the money market hedging, the third one. The fourth section would be option hedging, and the fifth section would be the use of the swap. And then we have the second category of the approach to deal with this type of uncertainty. That will fall into the so-called operational hedge technique. In other words, that we do not use financial contract, we use operational technique. Next slide. Exposure. What does it mean by exposure? Exposure simply means that subject to risk, subject to uncertainty. There are 3 different types of foreign exchange exposure, and the first category, the first type of exposure is the so-called transaction exposure. Transaction exposure means that whenever we have a shock, whenever we have a change in the foreign exchange rate, we want to know that to what extent, the value of contractual cash flow in terms of our home currency will change. And this kind of transaction exposure will exist whenever the contract is denominated in foreign currency. If it's denominated in our home currency, then there's no such thing as uncertainty, because the contract already specifies, this exact amount of US dollar that we will need to pay or will be able to receive. Then there will be no uncertainty in terms of the value denominated in US dollar. So transaction exposure, a very important part of transaction exposure is that that particular contract is denominated in a foreign currency. And due to the possible change of exchange rate down the road, therefore the value of that contractual cash flow measured in our home currency could go up or come down, depends on the change of the exchange rate. So that would be the first type of foreign exchange exposure. And that would be the kind of exposure that we want to talk about in this particular topic. And our next topic, when we move on to a new topic, we want to talk about so-called economic exposure. And here again, we're talking about a shock on exchange rate, whenever there's a change in exchange rate. But the kind of thing that we want to study this time is about the value of the firm. Not just the value in terms of our home currency for one particular contract. We are talking about the shock to the value of our entire firm. And that would be the so-called economic exposure. And the third type of exposure is the so-called translation exposure. Translation exposure refers to the kind of sensitivity that whenever we have a change in the exchange rate, then what kind of accounting item that we disclose in our financial statement, to what extent those numbers will change. So for accounting measure, translation exposure is something that your accounting professor will surely want to address, but not in this course, because we are a finance course, and I'm not going to talk about translation exposure. So in this topic, we are going to focus on the first type of foreign exposure, that will be transaction exposure. In our next topic, we want to talk about economic exposure. Okay, let's move on to transaction exposure. Transaction exposure, next slide, you say that whenever a firm has foreign currency denominated receivable or payable, this firm is subject to transaction exposure. Receivable means that cash flow coming in, and payable means that cash flow that goes out in the future. And if those cash flow, okay, are denominated in foreign currency, then we have exposure. And this also means that if those receivable or payable are denominated in our home currency, then we are not going to have transaction exposure. So whether we are going to have transaction exposure associated with a receivable or payable depends on what currency that those payable receivable would be specified. Okay, so that's very important. And also the size of those receivable and payable determine the size of exposure. If a pot of money, a lot of money is going to come in or we need to pay in the future denominated in foreign currency, then we have a greater amount of the impact. On the other hand, if we just have a very small amount of the foreign denominated account receivable or payable, then the amount of translation, the transaction exposure would be quite minimal. Then sometimes we don't even need to think about that kind of risk when the risk is so small. So usually when we talk about hedging, when we talk about risk management, usually we're focusing on those payable and receivable of a certain size denominated in foreign currency. Okay. And next slide. And here we want to talk about the use of financial contract, including forward contract and future contract. Forward and future, they play the very similar role. The only difference is that the forward contract could be tailor-made to the user, and future contract is a standardized contract. For each contract it has a certain size. And the second method is a money market hedging. And the third one is the use of option hedging. And the fourth one is a swap hedging. Next slide. And through the operation technique, in this topic we want to talk about three of them. And we are going to have a detailed discussion on that, including the choice of the invoice currency, including lead leg strategy, and exposure netting concept. And we will talk about when we move to almost the end of this topic. We will talk about each of those three operational technique. Next slide. And let's deal with this particular numerical scenario. Suppose that the Boeing export a Boeing jet to British Airline. When you sell, in this case, a good to a foreign customer, usually you do not collect money right away. You provide a so-called trade credit. In this case, let's assume that the trade credit term is a year, and the British Airways is going to pay 10 million British pound for this particular purchase. But Boeing is not going to receive 10 million pound right now, right away. They are going to receive that in a year. And so here we have a non-US dollar denominated receivable for Boeing. So this is denominated in foreign currency, not in home currency for Boeing. Okay. Therefore, we have a transaction exposure. Okay. And once we have this transaction exposure, and the Boeing may decide to manage this kind of risk. Let's go to the next slide. The first method that the Boeing will be able to use is to use a forward market hedge. Okay, and the strategy that the Boeing will be able to use is that whenever Boeing has a foreign currency receivable, like this particular case, right? That's a receivable of the 10 million British pound in a year. Then the Boeing ought to sell, okay, the 10 million British pound currency forward. Okay, by doing so, the Boeing would be able to lock in the current forward rate and such that there's a guaranteed amount of US dollar in a year. Okay, let's see how this thing works. Okay, and so because Boeing has a British pound receivable, therefore Boeing ought to sell for 10 million British pound, and this forward is going to mature in a year. And let's assume that Boeing make a phone call to Citi and ask that what is the current forward rate for British pound. Let's say that the Citi trader reply that currently the forward rate for a year is 1.46. Okay, and this means that the Boeing would deliver the receive 10 million British pound in a year, and then to Citi, and Citi in return is going to pay a Boeing 14.6 million US dollar in a year. Not today, will be in a year because this is a forward contract. Okay, so Boeing is going to deliver, because the Boeing sell this forward, deliver 10 million British pound, and that 10 million British pound would be a years later received from British Airways, and then the Citi is going to provide $14.6 million due to the forward contract that the Boeing signed with Citi today. So this 14.6 million US dollar cash flow in a year involving no foreign exchange risk, because you know for sure that that will be the amount of money based on the forward contract that Boeing signed with the Citi. Okay, and now let's have another scenario. Let's assume that in a year the spot rate for British pound turn out to be 1.4. Okay, let's assume that the Boeing does not lock in the 1.46 by using the forward. Then what would happen? Okay, if the forward decide not to use a forward hedging, and when the spot rate in a year turn out to be 1.5, then what would happen to the Boeing? In this particular case, that the Boeing would be able to use the 10 million British pound received from British Airways and turn that into US dollar based on the spot rate in a year. Let's assume that's 1.4. Then that would mean that the Boeing would be able to have 14 million US dollar in a year. And this 14 million dollars in a year, compared with the forward contract lock-in at 14.6, well, we would say that the forward transaction provide a capital gain in the amount of 0.6 million US dollar. That would be the exposed, that would after fact gain for the forward hedging. Okay, and of course, if you do not lock in the 1.46 exchange rate by using the forward contract, the spot rate in a year could be 1.4, or it could be higher, say 1.5. Okay, if it turns out to be something like a 1.5, higher than the forward rate, it would mean that actually there is exposed loss for the forward contract in the amount of $0.4 million. Okay, if the spot rate turned out to be 1.5 instead of 1.4. Okay, so without using the forward, then we subject to this kind of transaction exposure. With the use of forward, we lock into 1.46 exchange rate, then we basically kind of get rid of this kind of exposure by locking into 14.6 million US dollar in a year, that involving no risk in a year. And that's what we refer to hedging. Hedging means that we lock in one particular amount of foreign currency value today. Okay, and that amount will be delivered, will be realized in a year without any uncertainty. That's what we refer to hedging. Next slide. In addition to use the forward hedging, surely we can use futures because they're involving a very similar kind of economic function. Okay, And let's assume that if we decide not to use the forward hedging, we want to use the future hedging. First thing we will need to decide is that how many future contracts that we would need to sell. Okay, and in this particular case, that let's assume that we use the CME British Pound future contract, and we know that from our previous discussion, the standard contract size for one future contract is 62,500 British pound. And here we have a 10 million British pound, right? So we will need to divide 10 million British pound by 62,500 British pound, and that is going to give us 160. That's the reason why we say that the Boeing will need to sell 160 CME contract in order to taking care of this 10 million British pound exposure. Okay, and so then this would be one way to do it. Okay, if you do not sell British pound forward, then another alternative is to sell British pound future. Okay, but here you need to do a simple computation in terms of the number of a future contract that you will need to sell. In this case, that 160 contract. Next slide. Okay. The third method is to use the money market hedging. Okay, and the money market hedging, here we assume that the U.S. interest rate is 6.1%. The interest rate in the United Kingdom is 9%, and let's assume that the spot rate at current time is 1.5. Okay, let's take a look at this one. Let's look at this one. So here we have today, we have a years later. Under the years later, let me get. Okay. So under a years later, the Boeing would be able to receive 10 million British pound from British Airways. Okay, and the action today for the Boeing is to first borrow 9.174 British pounds, a million British pound. Okay, and the interest rate is 9%. So a years later, okay, when you borrow this amount a year later at the 9% interest rate, that would mean that we will need to pay $10 million back to the bank that we borrow money. And once we receive this $10 million from British Airways, we use this $10 million to pay off this $10 million liability that we owe to the bank. When we borrow money from the bank today, 9.174 million British pound. Okay, and once we obtain this amount of a loan from a British bank, or any kind of a bank has a British account, British pound account, we turn that into US dollar through the current spot rate, and here we have 1.5. This means that today we will be able to have 13.761 million US dollar, and we save this one into a US dollar saving account, and we'll be able to earn 6.1% a year. Okay, and it's going to grow to $14.601 million in a year. Okay, in other words, that through this money market contract, we'll be able to turn this 10 million British pound all the way to 14.601 million US dollar, and for sure through this set of the transaction. Okay, this means that we borrow British pound at a certain amount, such that we will owe the bank exactly 10 million British pound. That is exactly the amount that we'll be able to receive in a year. So we kind of cancel these two contracts, neutralize this contract, okay? And we turn the British pound that we borrowed today into US dollar, save that into a certain amount, and then this certain amount of US dollar will be the certain amount of US dollar we'll be able to obtain through this money market hedging transaction. Okay, so this is the money market hedging, and through this particular arrangement we can be sure that in a year, not today, in a year, that 10 million British pound would equivalent to 14.601 million US dollar, and with perfect certainty. And this is what we refer to money market hedging. Next slide. So we talk about the use of the forward or the future hedging, and now we talk about the use of the money market hedging. And usually the outcome or the result from these two different methodologies will be quite similar. Usually it would be quite similar. For example, the forward hedge that from our previous discussion, we are going to have 14.6 million US dollar in a year, and the use of a money market hedging is going to give us $14.601 million in a year. As you can see, these two numbers are very, very similar. And of course, money market hedging give us slightly more, $0.001 million. So a logical investor would surely, in this case, choose the money market hedging instead of the forward hedging. And of course, you might ask, how come the use of these two different methodologies that tend to come out with a result that are very, very similar? And that has something to do with the interest rate parity that we talked about when we were in topic number 4, when we talk about those foreign exchange parity relationship in the interest rate parity. And we have the equation in American term at the bottom of this slide. It says that the forward premium, that would be the left hand side of the equation, equal to the interest rate differential. As you can see that the forward rate F is tied to the interest rate ID and IF. And that's exactly the money market and forward contract hedging that we just went through. Okay. The interest rate in United States and the interest rate in United Kingdom and the forward rate, they're all kind of related to one another. That's the reason why the results are very similar, because forward rate and interest rate, according to interest rate parity, they are closely related. Next slide. Okay, now we wanted to move on to the use of option for hedging. And the strategy, okay, the strategy here is that the company will want to buy a foreign currency put. Quoted in American term, to hedge is foreign currency receivable. Okay, when you have a foreign currency receivable, like the case of a Boeing, when the Boeing has a receivable denominated in British pound, in the amount of 10 million British pound in a year, then Boeing has the foreign currency receivable, and the way to do it is to buy a British pound put option. Okay. On the other hand, for a company that has a foreign currency payable, then this company will need to buy a foreign currency call option. So this would be the strategy. And regardless whether it's receivable or payable, therefore whether it's a put option or a call option, the strategy here is always to buy, to own, to take on the long position. It's not to short, okay? It's to make a long position. It's just that whether we are talking about a put option or whether we are talking about a call option. Of course, a put option gives you the right to sell, okay? And the call option give you a right to buy. Okay, so next time when we come back, we want to go through this numerical example for the boy, and then to say something about, to show you that in what way we'll be able to use the option to derive at a very interesting set of the hedging outcome. Thank you.